Hi, it's Emily Leiphart of Art from the Heart, and this video is for the Simon Says Stamp and Mama Elephant Summer Garden Blog Hop. Simon Says Stamp and Mama Elephant has once again collaborated on an amazing floral stamp and die set. This one is called Summer Garden and sells separately or together. You can find all those links in the supply list on my blog or below this video. After I made this card using this stamp and die set, I decided that I needed to show you how I got the Femme Frames die to cut on an angle without losing the top right hand corner. The stitched rectangle simply isn't wide enough to extend out to the edge of the scalloped rectangle. You can see this when I hold the die against the card. The top right hand corner would be completely cut off if I die cut the stitched rectangle as is. First I'm going to create the card base by die cutting two scalloped rectangles. Both the scalloped and stitched rectangles are part of the Femme Frames die set. You can also find the link for this fabulous Mama Elephant product in my supply list. On my first card I used pattern paper from Dear Lizzie's Daydreamer paper pad, but since there was only one piece of this pattern I have to choose another with a similar blue, and I found one in Echo Park's Keep and Cozy paper pad. I'm going to cut a scallop panel from that to cover the card base. I use masking tape to hold the die in place to make sure that the polka dots line up with the die. I want the stitch panel to sit on an angle, and if I die cut the stitch rectangle as is, it wouldn't cover the top right hand corner of the pattern paper because it's too narrow. What I want to do is show the stitching on the left and bottom of the die, so the other two sides of the die don't matter in this case. This piece of white cardstock is 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches, basically what you'd cut to fold into the standard A2 size card. You'll see in a minute why I need a sheet this big. Since I only want to cut two sides of the die, a piece of my old broken cutting plate will come in handy for selective die cutting. I showed my broken plate in a previous video and mentioned that I had some ideas for using broken plates or smaller pieces of cutting plates, and this is one of them. This piece broke at about 2/5 of the original size, so it's perfectly sized to cover the area where I want the stitch detail to show. I carefully place it where I want the die to cut the cardstock and run it through the machine. Now the cardstock is cut exactly the way I want it. There's an expanse of cardstock to the right where I need it. Now I'm going to use a scalloped rectangle die to cut the remaining two edges of the panel. Before running this through the machine I have to cut off part of the cardstock since I'm now angling the panel and it's too big to fit on the cutting plate. I'll use this piece to die cut the flowers. When I have the die placed where I want it, I use masking tape to hold it in place and run it through the machine. Now my panel's done, and here's how it looks on the pattern paper over the card base. The way the summer garden dies are made, it's very easy to stamp the flowers, line up the dies, and die cut what you've stamped. For some reason I haven't really gotten into the habit of doing that, so here I am just die cutting a bunch of flowers and leaves, then stamping on the die cuts. I imagine it would be easier to die cut the stamping rather than to try and line up the stamps with the dies, but the flowers all have a distinctive petal that makes them really easy to line up with the dies. I'm going to stamp the biggest flower first, using Hero Art's Bubblegum Shadow ink. To line up the stamp with the die, I'm looking for that wider petal at the bottom right with a large gap to the left of it. As long as I make sure that two opposite petals are lined up and centered over the die cut, my stamping will be perfect. The second flower will be stamped with Hero Art's Pale Tomato Shadow ink. This flower has one lonely petal that stands apart from the rest. That's the one I'm looking for in the die cut to line up with the stamp. For the smallest flower, I'm using Hero Art's Poppy Chalk ink. I love this bright yellow that borders on orange. With only 5 petals and a distinctive shape, there's only one way to stamp this flower on its coordinating die cut. I'm going to speed up stamping of the leaves just a bit. In the stamp set, there are a few different leaves. I'm using the simple leaf that comes in 2 sizes, and I'm stamping 3 of each. This time I'm using Hero Art's Tide Pool Shadow ink. Now that all the stamping is done, I'm going to take my scoreboard and score one of the card base panels. This preserves the full front of the card, which is the scalloped rectangle die, and creates a fold for the card to open. I adhere the pattern paper to the front of the card, and then the special angled panel. After that, I can group the flowers and leaves. When I like the placement, I attach them to each other with glue dots. And then I add the leaves. I really love the ease of using glue dots. I can just tap my cardstock onto the roll and apply it where I want it. I don't have to flip over the flowers to apply liquid glue. I can just tuck the leaves underneath. This way I don't lose the overall visual and there's no break in my concentration. Now that the flower and leaf cluster is finished, I can determine placement of the sentiment. I'm in love with the fonts in this stamp set. They're so elegant and I can see myself being completely addicted to this stamp and die set. I'm stamping the sentiment in Hero Art's Stonewash Shadow ink. I love this grayish blue that has the tiniest hint of purple in it. I'm aiming to stamp the sentiment in the top right sweet spot, but first I want to figure out where the flowers will be adhered. I line up the card with a grid to show that it's 4 inches across. This means that the overhanging leaf on the left can stick out 1/4 of an inch off the card and still fit inside an A2 envelope. So now that the flower position has been determined, I can go ahead and stamp the sentiment. Although I love the card as it is, I want to add some microbeads to the centers of the flowers. Since this process involves glossy accents and I'm too lazy to wait for that to dry before assembling my card, I'm going to share a little tip for those of you who are as impatient as I am. What I do is apply my foam tape first, then lift off the corners of the backing so that it's much easier to remove after the flowers are embellished. I start with the largest flower and apply glossy accents inside all the little circles. I only do 1 flower at a time because I'm using a different color of microbead for each flower. I simply sprinkle these on the glossy accents, and I'm going to do this off camera to save time. I love how these microbeads look, especially on flowers. I repeat this process on the other 2 flowers. Once I'm done, I can flip over the flower cluster and remove the backing from the foam tape. Since the glossy accents are still wet, I have to be very careful around the flowers. Again, I line up the card with the grid mat to make sure that the leaf is overhanging the edge of the card by only 1/4 of an inch. Then I carefully press down on the leaves and petals, avoiding the microbeads. Now my card is done. Please refer to the supply links below if you're interested in any of the products I used in this video. You can also visit my blog for stills and more information about my cards. There are 2 giveaways associated with this summer garden blog hop, so be sure to leave a comment on my blog and at all the stops on this hop to increase your chances of winning. Thanks so much for watching.